Hello and welcome back again to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership and communication have always been connected intrinsically. My guest today kind of argues the point as to whether you could, in fact, replace the word leadership with the word communication, and we will be talking about that as we go through. And a big part of effective communication, of course, is asking the right questions. It's certainly one of those more useful skills that all leader managers can benefit from learning. And it can help in areas as diverse as problem solving and conflict resolution. It's also really helpful in coaching your teammates and your team members and broaching those difficult conversations that all leaders have to have sooner or later. So my guest today is Jay Williams, author, speaker, thinker, and ex-executive coach. Jay teaches leaders how to ask the right question to maximize communication, collaboration, and productivity.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast.
Leadership talk for the modern manager.
With your host, David Hatch.
So Jay, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate you taking the time. Tell us a bit more about career background, where you've come from, what drives you, and how you've ended up doing what you do today.
All right, I'll try to make it as concise as possible. I had a non-traditional start in the sense I moved out when I was 16. I grew up in Los Angeles and I moved to San Diego, and quite by accident got into the workforce. And once I was in the workforce, I thought, hey, I'll start college. And so I shared this story with you about college because I think now more than ever, there's this conversation is, do you need to go to college? And I think people are revisiting it because of the financial investment. Do you get a return on your investment? Student loans, things like that. So I share the story only as my story, not as any advice in any way. But for my circumstances, I began to work and I was going to college at the same time. Very quickly, I took to learning in the business setting. And I even shared with the person, you don't need to pay me. I'll come in between classes, whatever you want to share with me, I'll do. And very quickly, at 17, I got into a leadership or management role. And so it was in a retail type of environment. And then by the time I was 18, it's actually legal at that point to take a lie detector test, which people don't use much, but was a common practice. As you moved into management, and you would have exposure to money, company files, things like that. And so at 18, I found myself in a quote unquote management leadership role. And the way that I got there was really that as a super worker, I became a supervisor. And so one of the first lessons that in hindsight that I saw is that we, at least in the United States, and I see it replicated globally, I don't know what it's like for anyone listening, is this super worker becomes a supervisor very quick. So your best salesman becomes your sales manager. Your lead engineer now becomes a manager of the department. And what I saw was there's no correlation in the skill set. And so in my way, through sales, I was able to move up to leadership. But now I was in a role that I had no skill set. What served me well previously had nothing to do with my ability to have other people perform like me. So I'd say that was my first life lesson. And so for anyone listening, that's, I think, what triggered the thought of, hey, there's a different skill set here. And so really, I didn't have any mentoring along the way, but became fascinated with, I didn't have the skill set, where can I get it? And so where people traditionally have gone to school for this, I began to read, became an avid reader, and began to embrace and test some of these concepts. And some of the things that I saw as I moved up through my career is it wasn't really my technical skills, the things I knew about the industry, that were elevating or heavily weighting my success. It was my non-technical skills, my ability to communicate with people. And so what I quickly saw was there's a direct correlation between quote unquote leadership and communication. And so as I moved through my career, some things came very naturally to me, and I don't mean it in a boastful way, but for whatever reason, some of these communication skills came naturally, and there were others that I could learn. And so I share that with you because as I began to grow in my career, it gave me a different perspective on people I was trying to grow, because the question that I heard very early on is a leader born, or is that something that you grow into, nature or nurture? And I quickly began to believe for myself is that you're not born a leader. You might have some of the skills a leader has, but there's something that happens along the way that you embrace that role, or it's thrust upon you, and it can be taught. And so in San Diego, I had this career and began to move up in a way that was really more leadership, quote unquote, management based than anything else. And so just to jump ahead, I thoroughly enjoyed what I was doing. At one point, though, I wasn't having that same emotional return on my physical investment. I wasn't enjoying leading people. And as I looked at it, the part I didn't enjoy was being accountable for someone else's success. And I think that's another realization of leaders today, is that there's a responsibility, a job responsibility that's been added to them that they may not want. And if I look at an engineer, I look at a doctor or a scientist, they went to school for those skills, and all of a sudden they're doing something they don't want to do, but somehow, either through tenure or picking a number out of a hat, they became the leader. They still don't want to do it. And so there's an empathy I have because I went through that. And so I transitioned away from being in a corporate setting and being a leader in a corporate setting this way, is that I don't want to do those things, but what do I love about what I'm doing? And I love the piece of teaching. I love the piece of coaching and guiding people. And so that's where I transitioned out of corporate America into doing more of a consultative type of role. And it allowed me to talk about these things I believe in as far as development, communication, connection, culture, and doing what I want to do without having to do things I don't want to do. So it may seem hypocritical for anyone who's listening that I'm talking about leadership and it's not what I want to do. Where my passion, love comes in is in teaching these skill sets to people who either want to do it or it's been thrust on them, not by their choice.
Wow, you hit on a lot of different topics there. I'm sure we're going to come back to a few of them as we go.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's the one particular thing that stood out to me is very similar experience myself. Actually, you get, because you're good at the job you have, you get given a management position in that team. And my first role as a manager, again, I don't know if I remember whether I actually wanted to do it or not, but I don't remember not wanting to do it. Let's put it that way. But I was good at what I was doing, and the team was expanding, so I was given a couple of people to manage. I wasn't given any management training. I wasn't given any leadership training. I wasn't really given any additional support beyond what I was already getting. Yet I was expected to now be an effective manager. Mm-hmm. And it's I've always kind of assumed it's a UK problem in particular, but it sounds like it's crossed the pond as well.
It has, and it's spreading.
Yeah. I mean, over here we call it the accidental manager problem. And I think I was reading an article this morning about it where they reckon up to 60% of people in management positions have been given no management training. I don't know the source on that, actually. I should have checked. But, I mean, that's astonishing. If you think about other specialisms in the workforce, I can't think of any other job beyond sort of entry level, this is your first job, where you're thrown into it with no training.
It's when you look at it the way you do and you begin to compare it to other roles, there wouldn't be a doctor that'd be thrown in. There wouldn't be a lawyer there wouldn't be an engineer. And these roles they're equivalent titles. Yes, there's something within an industry, but there are people that are proficient at being leaders. And you even see them jump from industry to industry because they are proficient at being a leader. And so I think that a leader, there is universal applicability to that skill set, just like a doctor and engineer. And to your point, those people would not be put in those roles without any training or minimal training.
Yes, indeed. I mean, lawyer and doctor are the extreme examples, of course. But
Yeah, they certainly are. But again, if you went to, a police officer, even a chef, you wouldn't do it. I mean, there's some, whatever level it's at. And I think what you say is at the entry level, but even at entry level, when you look at leadership, there's a lot at stake because now it's not just themselves, it's whoever else they touch or they influence. In your situation, you mentioned there are 2 or 3 people. So now what's at stake is these 2 or 3 people and whoever they touch and whoever they influence. And what I see in smaller companies, that this is a common practice. It's standard operating procedures that if we start off with 5 or 6 people, when we do need leadership, we go, okay, who's been here the longest, right? And that's usually how that person moves up. What happens, that organization that's 5 or 10 grows to 50, and then they grow to 120, and now these people have moved up, and all of a sudden the CEO, who's quote unquote the leader, does not have these skill sets at all. And so what's happening is the people they're bringing in under them aren't held to any standard. They aren't taught these skills. And that's where I see that the risk that you run is that this type of thinking becomes contagious, is that leadership is not a necessity. It's a nice to have. It's not a must have. And now you have an organization of 1,200 people and you have a management team. You just don't have any leaders. And so I will ask an organization when I sit down with them, and if you start at that C level, is how many managers do you have? And I think you can relate to it. They'll bring out the organizational chart and they'll say, here's how many managers. And then I follow up with how many leaders do you have? And I ask in that order intentionally, because if I ask how many leaders, they group the two, manager and leader, together. And so I would share with you, and it's probably not new to any of your listeners or you. So there is a common definition as we move forward. A manager, I think, focuses on process and procedure. And this leadership component would focus on people. So that's how I would differentiate. And then I think when I share that common definition, and again, there's other definitions, it's just for the point of conversation, that the leaders in the organization or management in the organization quickly can articulate, yeah, we have a lot of managers. We have few, if any, leaders. And interestingly enough, their challenges are usually not technical challenges. If they are, they can solve them. It's the people.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's a good definition. Yeah, I mean, I kind of think if you're going to be a good manager, you need to be able to do both. And that's quite difficult. You can find someone who's good at kind of the process, the administration, the sort of the on-paper management. It's quite rare, I think, to find someone who already has both of those skill sets. Leadership can definitely be taught. I agree with you there as well. And that, I think, is where a lot of organizations fall down. They see someone who's good at that management side of it, the process, the admin, and they assume that that's going to make them good at managing the people as well. And actually, that's very rarely the case.
You see it in sports. It's interesting. And so, for people who are listening, I don't know how applicable this will be, like based on where the sport ranks, but in the United States, basketball, I'm a huge basketball fan. And so when you look at, like I grew up in Los Angeles with the Lakers and Magic Johnson, he individually was arguably, some say the best player, some say in the best 5, 10, but he winds up somewhere in the top 50. His coaching and leadership experience was dramatically different versus being an individual contributor. And I think as when you identify who's going to be this leader and who they're going to influence, what you have to ask yourself is, do they have the ability to replicate what you are promoting them for? Because what got them promoted could get them fired. they were a great individual promoter, but now if they're going to compete with their team, or they're going to hold them to a standard that they can't coach them to, which was the example with Magic Johnson when he coached for the Lakers, is he had a standard, but he didn't know how to coach his players to that standard. He could do it. And so when we talk about this, I think that this becomes imperative for organizations that if they want to promote from within, which, by the way, that could be the competing part of the cultures that we, quote unquote, have this value where there's a value of loyalty and we want to support growth mindset and that you can grow within the organization. You just want to put people in this position where they can continue to grow and to be successful, not the Peter principle, that you reach your highest level of inadequacy. And unfortunately, that's what happens, is that you promote this individual contributor and you lose your best salesperson, best engineer, right, best scientist, and now you've gained at best a dynamically mediocre manager, and at worst an HR nightmare. And there's an organization I was working through, and it was in biotech, and they had chemists. And so, again, they had grown from 5 to 6 to 10 to 20 to 30 people. Well, what did they do? They took their lead scientists and made them a manager. Now people underneath were coming to HR and going, I quit. I hate my manager. They're confrontational, right? All these things. So it's a reality. And I think as you look at who's going to be that person is, nature versus nurture. Is that person already? And if they're not, do we have the resources? Do we have the people? Or will we give them the resources to become that person we need? A lot of people go, well, I just hope that they'll grow into that person. And, I'm a faith-based guy, so hope has a place. It's just in business, it's not a strategy where you're not going to do anything else and just rely on hope.
No, in a perfect world, there'd be a management program that happens before the promotion.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're almost doing the job already, in theory. Yeah, I love that you said that, is that it's not that you wait to that point to start doing the job, that you've begun to demonstrate those skills. And I think in a conversation, if we could go off topic a little bit, one of the things personally, is if I'm going to add value to an organization, is I think we need to rethink our current thinking. And I think there's some rebranding that needs to go on with some terms. And one of them is leadership, because the number one component of leadership that I'm finding I'm spending the most time on is communication. And I'm almost wondering, really, is it about being a great leader, or is it about being a great communicator? And is that the conversation? And how would that change the dynamic in the organization? Because like I said, I am encountering CEOs that go, Jay, I just don't want to do this. If I can hire someone up, that's not what I want to do. I want to have a relationship with the board. I want to be a visionary. I'm not looking to groom my next leadership team. If you took that off the table and you thought, well, what about being a great communicator? Because now this touches every aspect of the business. So I'll pause there. I think that's the opportunity right now, is if you substitute leadership with communication, and all the work begins around how effective you are as a communicator.
I see communication as one of the kind of the key pillars of successful leadership, definitely. I don't know if you could fully replace leadership in its entirety with just communication. I think there are other aspects involved. But certainly it's got to be one of the top three, hasn't it?
I think, yes. So the question becomes is, with leadership, what is addressing the symptom and what's addressing the problem? And so when you talk about it, yes, is it interchangeable all by itself? No. Is it part of the DNA that has to exist? So even when I think you talk about empathy as an example. So there's interesting how our language and verbiage has changed in business, because empathy wasn't something that even 3 years ago was part of the nomenclature, right? So when you say that, I wouldn't argue that point. I think there needs to be some things. I think empathy, the way that you gain it is through communication, right? And so in order for me to somewhat empathize, and I differentiate between empathy and sympathy, but for empathy, I think there's a certain understanding. That understanding comes from the way that you communicate. So the way that you communicate may be the questions that you ask. It may be the way that you listen so that you can communicate from the other person's perspective. I mean, arguably the best communicators and the best leaders have the ability to communicate from the other person's perspective. They feel as though you get me, you have my best interest. And so I wouldn't argue your point that word for word it could be traded out. What I would want to invite people to is whatever you're doing is to foundationally ask where are our communication skills, because I think that will be the rocket fuel that drives whatever leadership rocket ship that you have.
Maybe another way to look at it is communication is the vehicle for the success of leadership. I mean, if you think about other things that we associate with good leadership, it's, you know, things like empathy, trust, respect, you know, leading by example, things like this. All of those things really are wrapped up and achieved by effective communication at the end of the day.
I agree 100%. I think when you talk about respect, so that's one of the things that, and I don't want to speak for anyone who's located in any other part of the world. I mean, my quote unquote expertise would be from what I experience every day in the United States. And so I think the world's pretty aware of what's going on for us. But over the last probably 6 years or so, our definition of respect has, it's been degraded, I would say. I think a universal definition of respect at some point in time is that I will be respectful whether I respect your opinion or not. So whatever your opinion is on the vaccination, whatever your opinion is on politics, religion, identity choices, where you work from, whether I respect it or not, I will still be respectful. What's happened that we're experiencing, I think, in the United States is if I don't respect your opinion, then I don't need to be respectful. And at the highest levels, we've demonstrated that. And so when you go back to communication, I think part of the communication is to have a common definition of words. I mean, that's the only way you could communicate. If somebody's listening to this that's in a different country and they have a different definition of the word I'm using, you could see how our communication would be off to a flying stop. And so I think as I'm talking to you, I'm trying to talk myself into, you know, what I believe so much. So for anyone listening, it's I really want to supercharge this leadership conversation because I think people's attention spans are shrinking too. So we can talk about a lot of the traditional leadership principles, but I think people just tell me, how do I fix this problem? And I think if we can start there, like you said, it becomes this rocket fuel for this rocket ship of leadership.
Yeah, flying stop, by the way, love that.
Okay, yeah. Unfortunately, I've been a victim of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been interesting politically, hasn't it, in the last few years? And yeah, I mean, it's been very, I don't know, similar in terms of words like respect and kind of how those are seen at sort of the national level. Certainly, we've had similar issues here, and even trust as well. You know, if in the political arena, at least, trusting our leadership in politics doesn't mean the same as it used to mean. You know, it used to mean I trust that person is telling the truth and trying to achieve the best thing for the electorate.
Yeah,
that doesn't seem to be what it means anymore.
It's you know, first of all, I mean, I think everybody would agree that trust is the new currency, right? Whoever has the most of it wins an election, right? And I'm not saying has all of it, but has the most of it, but finds a way to do it. And, you know, you mentioned trust and respect. I want to give credit where credit's due. I read a book called Presence by Amy Cuddy, and she's a social psychologist at Harvard. And in her research, this stuck out for me in the book, that she said, regardless of where she was in the world, the two things that human beings seek out in every interaction are trust and respect. And isn't it interesting in the course of our conversation that those two words have came up. And so I think, your topic is leadership. And if anybody's listening, they go, well, where can I even start? I think it's with those two things, is trust and respect, and going back to your team or the individual or your organization, whoever you require trust from, and just having that conversation on a scale of 1 to 10, where is your trust with me as a leader, as a manager, right, as a technical resource? Because trust does vary from task to task. So I think even when you look at our government, where there are areas we have higher levels of trust and areas we have lower level of trust. Like our government, we might have a higher level of trust to protect us as it relates to war. As it relates to doing what's best for our interests, as it relates to taxes, maybe not, our personal choices. And so as a leader, is that one that we look at trust, and then that it's not an overarching thing, do you trust me or not, is that we break it down by task based on where we need them to trust us. And then the other question is how do you define respect? And then how close am I coming to your definition of respect in our relationship? And I think it's reciprocated too, in hopes that the employee would ask, where are my levels of respect? And I think that opens up the conversation in a non-threatening type of way, because I deal with a lot of conflict resolution and mediation. And people ask, where do you start? I think it's starting around trust and respect. And I think it's starting with a question, not a statement. And I think it starts with getting the other person's perspective first before you share yours. And so people ask me, with that work, where does it start? That's where it starts, with trust and respect, getting the other person's perspective, and asking with a question.
It's a good place to start, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, just establishing the baseline as well. You've got to know where you're starting from before you can improve.
I mean, imagine religion and politics, right? Remember when that was a taboo topic about 7 or 8 years ago? You never talked about religion or politics, right?
Yeah.
My experience now, and again, I want to be respectful to anyone who's listening. I think I'm making statements based on an overarching generality. There may be some unique situations to where you're listening, and I want to respect that. So for the point of conversation, is I've never encountered an experience around religion and politics where the other person has asked me my perspective first. They've never, I don't know about you, has anyone ever said, well, I would love to talk about religion. Before we get started, what are your thoughts? Or, hey, this political climate's got kind of heated. Before I start, what are your thoughts on that? My experience is that they want to convince me somehow. They want to share their perspective. And what happens is, for me personally, there's not a natural curiosity, because I feel as though we're off to a flying stop. That's the way I feel we are, is you're not here to listen. You are here to convince me. You're not here to try to understand. You want to be understood. And I just think that there's a universal applicability to this approach. And I've noticed with people who are effective leaders that they always start off with asking a question to understand the other person's perspective. And to your point, I think it's good to establish a baseline. And hey, are we, we use this analogy, are we on the same page? I don't know if that's a universal analogy or not, but sometimes you're not even in the same book or the same library, you know what I mean? But we think, oh, let me just start talking about this. And so to your point, I think if you can ask that question, here's a formula that I believe to be true in my experience, is that when you ask a question, it leads people to believe that you care. You care about their perspective, about their situation. When people think you care, it leads to trust. And so trust is, and that's really the life hack, so to speak, or the shortcut, I think, for any leader, is ask a question, whether you know the answer or not, because I want people to think that I care, and I want them to trust me, because I know the higher the level of trust, the higher the speed in which things are going to happen. And so in the work that I do, if there's a methodology attached to it that I would invite leaders into, it is asking a question and starting every interaction conversation with a question versus a statement.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about communication as well. And I think, the more than 50% of communication, I think, has to be listening. And I think starting with a question is a great way to force yourself to listen and hear what's being said. Whereas a lot of leaders and managers perhaps fall short of that, shall we say.
And that's why I go back. And again, it's not to argue it, it's just to think through is, could communication replace leadership? Is that one of the top 3 attributes, I think, unequivocally? And I think, you said, I heard this statistic, I'm not sure where I heard it from. I heard at one point 83% of all statistics are made up. So, there's a little bit of a joke in there. My experience has been, when I ask people, what are the attributes or skills of a great leader? What you just said is in that top 3, is that they listen. So if 50% of your effectiveness of a leader is listening, that goes right back to communicating. Listening is that tool. And so, as we're talking through this, it's giving me this conviction of my belief that maybe there's a different place for us to start, or maybe there's a place we could all agree upon where we start as it relates to this quote unquote leadership journey or evolution as a leader.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you get no argument from me about the importance of listening and communication more widely. And I think, there's sub-elements to all of that. I think doing it in a consistent way is also massively important when you're in any kind of leadership role in an organization. You can't say one thing and do another. You can't say one thing one week and then change your mind 10 minutes later without explaining why. And, there's a whole massive issue, isn't it, all wrapped up in one very simple-ish word of communicating.
Well, you brought up something that I think is a reality of leadership. Someone asked me, where do you think leadership's going? And you just articulated is that you may say something one week, it may be different the next week. And I think that's more of a reality than ever that as a leader you need to be aware of, because things are changing at a rapid rate. I'd like to think you and I are a younger side, but however, we'll run into 20-year-olds and that won't be the case. But in any event, in my lifetime, I have not seen the amount of change in a tight period. And so when you look at the last 3 years, just from a technology standpoint, from a social mood swing, so to speak, there's just been this dramatic change. And so as a leader, I think the new leader has to develop a comfort level of functioning in an environment where they're unclear of the future. They can't be uncertain on how they're going to respond to it. You have to be comfortable with going to your team and saying, whatever I share with you, it's only permanent till it changes. So let me just tell you that. But here's my commitment to you is that if there is a modification or evolution in what we're doing, I'll have this open, honest, on-time communication with you. And as a leader, if I gave you direction that's not relevant or it's inaccurate, as a leader, I will be the first to tell you, because I think you need that from your people right now. We need this feedback that's just not good or bad. It's just data and information. And so as a leader, are you willing to be vulnerable? And someone asked me in one of my books, he said, oh, you're very vulnerable in the first book. And I said, oh, how's that? Because in my evolution, I wasn't vulnerable. They said, oh, you shared a story in there. I said, I was transparent. I wasn't vulnerable. And they go, what's the difference to you? I go, well, vulnerable is where you share something that someone potentially could think less of you. And I think as a leader, when you say, I don't know, in your mind, there's a potential the person could think less of you. What I'm experiencing is that people think more of you because they're like, okay, this is the norm. And if they're willing to do that, I'm willing to do that. Unless now we can have a conversation about this. And so when you said that, that resonated with me because I see leaders that, we need to, pivot, right, versus persevere. And then when do we do it? Sometimes we don't pivot when we need to because we're afraid that, well, we told them this, and now that we're going to have to admit that we are wrong. I think more than ever as a leader, you need to be prepared to do this. Tell them that there's going to be the potential that I make a decision that I thought was right in the moment, and I'm going to have new and different. Wouldn't it be great at politics, right? That's their whole thing. Yeah, but you voted this way. Yeah, but you supported this. If a leader came out and said, yes, that is true, and what I've learned from there has led me to this point. And I feel that's so easy to do. However, they're not willing to be vulnerable to say that I was wrong. So sorry, I got on a pedestal there, but you triggered something as far as how's a leader become effective. You have to be comfortable with that.
Yeah, no, I'm trying very hard not to stray into politics because it's something that really winds me up.
Okay, and I don't want to. I just want to show the universal applicability. That's all. Please, let's
it winds me up in the way you wind up a toy and set it off.
Oh, okay. Okay. Good analogy. Yeah.
I think particularly with what's going on in the UK politically in recent sort of months and years, and I think I've got a friend who calls it mental gymnastics that some of our politicians have had to do in order to not admit they made a mistake or they're wrong, and therefore they don't have to apologise. And you just kind of think, there's that, with all the things that you were just saying, I think fundamentally people have always trusted and respected leaders who they feel are honest, who are being open and transparent with them in whatever context. Maybe the change we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is because of all this added uncertainty. Suddenly that honesty, that transparency is a lot more important to people, and they are a lot less willing to overlook not having it than they were before. But
I wrote down what you said, which is a great conversation, are people more interested in their leaders being honest or right? Because what you just said, that's almost a juxtaposition, like for some people, right? And so without getting into politics, just because it's an example I think the world has been exposed to, is that we've had people in the leadership in the United States that I think it was more important for them to be right than to be honest. And they weren't the same thing. And so they deferred to being right. And in the process, people lost trust with them. And I think leaders, this is a choice that they make on a day-to-day basis. And I would feel as though as making an impact if people develop the comfort level to choose honesty over being right. Now, doing the right thing is different. I'm just saying being right, even if you aren't. Right. So I want to be careful with the politics things because I don't want that filter to derail this conversation. So I'm going to be very comfortable with that. I think we both know what we're talking about.
I think the trouble is it's such an easy example, isn't it? When you're looking for here's an example of the opposite of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it is so easy. And, one of the things professionally, I've made a mistake. So for anyone who does what I do, so if you're doing something that's in a training or consulting or leadership, you realize there's a visual medium that works for the brain. And so you look, and when you're speaking globally, if I reference someone that's only familiar to our culture, it's not relevant. So we do look at political figures because of this universal applicability. And one thing that I've learned professionally is that when I've done that, it's for the people that's painted a perfect picture, it's diluted my influence for the other people who don't. And so it, like you said, my friend, it's the low-hanging fruit. It's like when your friend tells you a joke and you go, oh, don't go there, but it's just right there. And, I also think that even as a leader, those are some of the choices that we make now. And I think when, if people don't mind, which I won't know because it's a podcast and we'll hear later, gender identity, I think is a global conversation now. Okay, just checking in for anyone listening. So, in the United States, it's, we've had almost this perfect storm. So when you look at the political choices, you look at the health choices. I mean, at one time, getting a flu shot was getting a flu shot. And did you get one? Yes or no? That was the end of it. Now, there's a lot of connotations to it. along the way, we've certainly experienced some things from a race standpoint that have been heightened during this period of time. And it's not whether it's rightfully addressed or not. I think it's always the right time to do the right thing. I think Martin Luther King said that. So that's not the point. And then there's this identity choices that we've made. But any one of them culturally could define a decade. And now we have these 4 in the last 3 years. And I think that some of the cultural impact that could be had is lost when people aren't sensitive to, it's either going to be what you say, how you say it, or when you say it, right? And so I think a lot of the messages, it's not what you're saying, it's how we're saying it, or it's when we're choosing to say it. And when, this topic is about leadership, and again, and this is why I go back to communication, because great communicators they have this heightened awareness of what I'm saying, and then how I'm saying it, and when I'm saying it. And so as we're talking through, I realize it wasn't your objective, but it's giving me the confidence, I think, to move forward with at least a starting point for leadership and conversations. So thank you for that.
Good, I'm pleased.
Okay, good. Yes.
Yeah, I think, it's going back again to kind of being right versus being truthful.
Mm-hmm.
Only one of those really is 100% within your control.
Oh, that's a brilliant statement. I'm going to take notes on what you're saying. 100%. Yeah.
It's like, everyone wants to do their absolute best to be right, of course. But, we're humans, we're flawed, we're not perfect. The information we have access to is not always going to be perfect. So we've just got to accept, and this applies to leaders as much as anyone else. You're not always going to be right. You can't necessarily control that. So the best thing then really for your interactions with people is be honest.
I love it. I wrote that down, that only one's 100% within your control, because I think now when you talk about leadership, I think there's some insecurity because we feel as though things are out of control. I think somebody as a leader, they have the skill set to balance the thinking with what do we have in control. And what we do have in control is the ability to be honest. One of the things that I think as you talk about this is one of them is subjective as well. The truth is very subjective, right? Because there could be the truth and your truth, right? And I think with honesty, there's depths of honesty, certainly, because somebody could be open and honest, they're just not on time with it. I just think it's a great filter. But even within a culture, I think when you talk about leadership, is that leaders have established, and let's just take it down to a micro level, meaning organizations, and take it off of the government. So even if you have a small to mid-sized business, or you're one of the Fortune 100 or 1000, is that cultures that in their DNA have honesty, that it's been rewarded for being honest. And generally, when we think about honesty, it's about when there's a mistake. So just for the purpose of that, have cultures where they celebrate mistakes, or it's okay. Just don't hide it from us. And whatever it is, we can fix it. I think that this trust that we talked about, that's what supercharges the trust in the environment, is where you have this open, honest communication. You just need to define the honesty part and somehow reward the honesty, that it's okay if you make a mistake. It's okay if you did the wrong thing for the right reason. Whatever it is, we can fix it. What we can't fix is if you're not honest and we don't know about it. So again, I think it feeds into the narrative you're talking about, is what's entirely within our control as a leader is the honesty part. You should do a podcast. You'd be a good guest.
Oh, that's a good idea, yeah. You're right. And you mentioned openness as well. I suppose it's possible to be honest without being open necessarily. Maybe being honest, but not as transparent. You could, I suppose if you say nothing in a way that is truthful, but I don't know.
It could be less, it could be, and see, I think this is where communication comes in, because more than ever, people I have found define words differently. And so this is a low hanging fruit. But if I say family to the listeners and ask them to write down their definition of family or what theirs look like, so you're going to have some listeners who've had the same mom and dad for 30, 40 years. You're going to have some people who are products of a divorced family. You're going to have some people integrated families. You're going to have some people have same-sex families. You're going to have some people who grew up in the foster system. So again, I keep saying this, we're off to a flying stop, because I mentioned family and you come to work for our company and their family was abusive and they go, oh my God, I don't want anything to do with the family. So when you talk about honesty, I think in a culture and you're onboarding people, is that you ask people how they define it. Right. And how you define it as an organization, because what's most important is how you define it. And if they're not going to match up to your definition of honesty, what I want to know is how flexible are you in that? And what would it take for you to be that honest in our culture, especially if that's part of the DNA. So any organization I work with, I feel as though that's imperative. If you don't have a culture where people can be honest, the consequences and repercussions, I think everybody knows that are there. But what drives business is momentum. And anything that will slow that down, like a lack of honesty, right? So you can, there's a large software organization that I was working with, and they had a product release. And the engineers knew that the product was flawed. Yet they were getting pressure from up above, and I think people can relate to this. We've got to hit this product release date. We're going to be anniversarying another product. We have to hit sales. And they didn't feel as though they could be honest, because there would be consequences about the flaws in the software they were releasing. So you see where that conversation, but where does that start? Now, that could not be the culture if someone's had a bad experience, right? However, you can see where it slows down the momentum, because all of a sudden that person's not working with the same vigor that they were before. They don't have the emotional commitment to the company that you need. Now, you may have their mental, physical, financial commitment, but not their emotional commitment.
You mentioned the word family there in the context of business, and I must say that's one of my pet peeves, is when businesses refer to their employees as part of the family. I mean, for me, it's always a red flag, because to start with, you don't necessarily get to choose your family, but you definitely get to choose where you work, right? So
yes,
a leader who tries to sort of combine those two things, in my mind, is always a little bit sketchy.
I love this conversation, because as a leader, this is where communication, perspective, and question asking. So before I tell you we have a family culture, I would ask you, when I say the word family, what does that mean to you? And if you shared what you did, I would then look for a different conversation. So I may not leverage that part of our culture. I may talk about the things that family provides when you work for us. So what I might say is, I thank you for sharing that and tell them that's great. That gives me some context for you. One of the things I think you'll like here is that we have collaboration here. One of the other things that we have is we have quote unquote unconditional love, meaning that if you make a mistake and it's for the right reasons, we've got your back. And so a leader is effective in their communication and their listening skills to hear these words, so that they become very selective in the words. The words carry great weight. And I love that you gave that example, because in the United States, people all the time like, oh, we're a family here. Listen, my mom was married 4 times. She wasn't married to my father. So when you say a family, I'm like thinking the Addams family or the Manson family. Like, which family are you referring to? So I love that you say that. An effective leader, they lead by asking questions, and they lead by gaining perspective. And again, as we talk through this, I think you can see, I think if someone's an effective communicator, which includes listening and asking questions, it's not always what you say. I think more importantly, it's what you ask. And effective leaders, I feel as though, can even use questions, and when they're really effective, to help people discover what they already know. I mean, that's really an effective leader. It's an effective salesperson, effective parent, effective coach. But that's my point. Is this really a leadership skill, or is it a communication skill.
Yeah, you might be starting to sway me.
That's okay. I just need you to move a little bit of progress.
I guess my point was it's about the choice of language, isn't it? As much as anything, which is of course communication. And maybe it speaks to my biases. I mean, I come from a very happy family background. We're very, very fortunate actually. But when you know things about the leader who is saying that, or you've seen the way perhaps they interact with members of their family in the office, or you've seen the way they interact with employees in the office, and you think, well, is that the way you treat your family? And it kind of, it gets wrapped up in some sort of assumptions or a trust, respect, judgment, perhaps again. And it's just one of those words, it's a funny word to apply to business, I think.
You brought up another point about word or vocabulary in business, and it's evolved quite a bit. For anyone's listening, I mean, trust has been on the radar for, Stephen Covey wrote Jr., The Speed of Trust. So that's been on the landscape for about 15 years, more widely adopted maybe in the last, 7 to 18 years. But again, I worked with an organization last year, and one of the executives said, can you give me a different word? I don't use trust in business. That's something for my personal life. Very interesting. However, I could understand that. The other word is empathy, is the number one attribute or skill. I think it's a skill. That could go back and forth. I think sympathy is a skill. Empathy may be something that is innate in you. But in any event, is empathy, right? That's not a word you would have used 7 or 8 years ago. And then you look at Marcus Buckingham that just wrote a book, Love and Work. Now, you would not have incorporated love. So to your point, there's a new vocabulary in business that's beginning to integrate, quote unquote, humanity. And I think in business, unsuccessfully, people have tried to extract humanity. And in all my work, I want to create a compelling human case. And for those who don't care about humanity, a compelling business case. But in an ideal situation, they would have universal applicability to things that we're talking about. And, people ask, what are the two most important things a leader has to have with their people? And, I'd say that they trust and they respect them. And then I think that they need to like them. And people go, well, I go, listen, that may be subjective, but just in your personal life, isn't it easier to follow someone that you trust, you respect, and you like? And so you go back to politics, do I trust the person? Yes. Do I respect them? Yes. Do I like them? No. I mean, let me take it down a level. I've gone to doctors. I think of when my wife had her second child. We went to a doctor. I trust and respect. I didn't like him. His bedside manner was not great, but I trust and respected him, right? What would have made the whole experience easier is if I trust, respected, and liked him. And I think as a leader, that's imperative. It'll make things a whole lot easier. So I wouldn't negate it. However, if you have to choose between the two, I would go with respect. Now, one of the things, if you don't mind me segueing a little bit, is this has been a common question, is can you be a friend to the people you lead? I don't know if that's cultural, or in the UK, would that be something that would come up? Is like, can we blend these two things, or do you guys naturally go to the pub and have a pint? I'm making up phrases I've heard. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the individuals. I think there's a lot of kind of management culture that's quite old-fashioned, where it's kind of, you create this artificial barrier sort of between management and employees, and that they won't socialize together, and that's that. That's not as common as it used to be. I don't know. I personally would find it very difficult to lead people if I couldn't interact with them about more than work. And I would extend that to, going for a pint after work, or, every month or something we go out for lunch, stuff like that. But at the same time, does that mean we're friends? I might think we're friends. I don't know if my teammates saw me that way or not. And it does get difficult, doesn't it? When you've got that kind of manager, leader, employee, follower sort of dynamic. And you do sometimes question, so a simple example is, you're the manager, you tell a joke, everyone laughs. Did they laugh because they think you're friends, you share the sense of humor, and they found the joke funny? Or did they laugh because they see you as the boss and they want you to think that they think your jokes are funny because they think that's going to make their life easier.
It's worth going to a pub and having a pint and talking about it,
isn't it?
Here's because this comes up more than it ever has before for me, and I think the reason is that with the pool of employees, which in the United States is very shallow to say the least, that companies are working with what they have people-wise. And so what's happening is they do need leaders and they want to retain their people. And they think one of the reasons that we could is if we promote them, right? Which is a whole different conversation. However, this person who was friendly, they were friends first because they were peers. They are now in a role where they're supervisor, leader, manager, whatever term you're going to use. And this is where the question comes up. Do I need to now have a division where we can no longer be friends? One of the things that conversation I invite them into is that you can be friendly without being a friend, and that you can differentiate. Because when you talk about friend and a leader, I ask them, what are 3 qualities you want in a leader? They go, I don't know, I respect, trust, and like them. I'm making something up, or they're honest, but you can see where I'm going. I said, well, what are the top 3 or 4 attributes in a friend? I want to respect them, trust them, and that they're honest, that they're like them. So if you talk about what's in common, then yes, those traits still need to exist. I think where the lines get blurred is that unequivocally the data is supporting that people want a human connection at work. Now, to what degree do they want it, right? But we got to consider that it's no longer, hey, I do my work and I can go out and socialize. They're spending 40 hours there a week. They're commuting 10 hours a week. So they're thinking about now you're up to 50 hours. And then when they go home at bed, so you're up to 60, 70 hours easily. And it's a slight exaggeration, and it's not, depending on what you do. And so if you do like what you do and who you work with, there is a benefit. I think the challenge becomes is that when, as a leader, you're doing things that they trust and respect you and like you in that capacity, and then when you go to the pub for a pint, so to speak, all of a sudden you're doing things that they don't trust, respect, or like, right? So, for me, people ask me, I can socialize with my clients. I had a company up until 2 years ago that I divested from, and I went out with employees and I socialized. I'm the same guy all the time. There's anything that I don't say in front of my wife that I didn't say in front of them, and whether I have a drink, I would do in front of you, or I'm the same guy all the time. So for me, it's very easy to do. Now, if you're 2 different people, and again, I'm not here to judge, I'm just here to help. I would invite you into a conversation, how do I become one person, right? But if that's not the case, then you may want to, if you feel as though it may dilute my trust and respect at work, then I think maybe your strategy works for you. So I can't tell you it's an emphatic yes or no. I just give you those filters in making your decision. For me, it's easy. I don't believe I'm going to lose any respect because I don't lose it at work, and I'm going to be that same guy, so nothing would change. I tell the same jokes at work that I tell socially. And listen, there's inner circles, don't get me wrong. I'm just talking at a high level of friendship.
Yeah, and what you're talking about there, I think, really it comes down to authenticity as a leader, doesn't it? It's being that same consistent person, and the easiest way to do that is just be yourself, right? So
100% of the time, yeah.
It's like they don't lie, because then you don't have to remember as much. If you're telling the truth, it's only one thing to remember.
I love that you said that. Yeah. Because I think that's where the tension sets in. Should I say that? Ooh, what did they say? What did I say last time? What was my stance on this? And that's why if you just go along to get along with people, it could be a conflict. When you say, do you laugh at the boss's joke? Here's the reason if I work for someone, I would laugh at their joke, is because I do the same thing for a stranger. That's part of my values. That's just me being respectful to you. That's me being kind to you. That's me being generous. So those same filters work all the way around. Listen, if my son's told me a joke, I'd probably laugh the same way. So that's what I mean. I'm the same guy. If something's really not funny, I would tell him, all right, give me time just to process that, right? But I'm going to show up. And that's where, you know, I think it works for you is because you're just the same person all the time.
And the friend versus manager question, I suppose, I think it'd be good, it'd be better for everyone, the manager included, if they can be friends with the people they're responsible for. The only time I can see it being challenging is when you have to have those difficult conversations. If someone's underperformed or there's a deadline coming and you don't think people are going to meet it, or the team's falling short in some way, then there's tension there. But at the same time, I don't know about anyone else, but in my life, the people who I find it easiest to have difficult conversations with are my friends. If that kind of that underlying level of trust is there is a friendship there. Personally, that makes it easier to have that, mate, we're having an issue here. It makes it easier to have that difficult conversation, right?
I've heard both sides of the coin. I've heard yours. They said, no, with friends and family, I know them really well. I can say anything. Then I've heard people say, no, I can do it at work because I don't really know them and we're not friends and I'm not looking. So I've heard both sides. I think what's important is if you're going from a peer, quote unquote, into a role where people would report into you, is that you have this open, honest, on-time communication up front. So if you got with me and you said, hey, Jay, I just want to understand your perspective on how this new role will impact my ability to be a leader. Where do you see our relationship as friends, or how I show up as a friend, impacting my ability to hold you accountable to deadlines, to projects, to things like that? And that's where, again, the communication comes in. And that's where you can mitigate this conflict. It's about prevention, not intervention. It's about prevention. And so as a leader, if you can anticipate some of these things and have these preventative conversations. And so even if you're already hearing this conversation, you go, well, I'm well into it, I've missed that point. I would just get with your people and say, hey, I heard a podcast talking about friends versus leaders. And ideally, I'd like to be both. How do you see our friendship impacting my leadership? How do you see my leadership impacting our friendship? And then you're going to have to make a choice as a leader too, if you have to give and take in one area where that is. And maybe you spend less time with that person because there is a performance issue that doesn't affect your friend. Listen, how many of my friends am I going to hold to really, a standard, being punctual, things like that? But however, with work, there's other people that are impacted. Now, I get your response because I do hold my friends to a standard, but it's usually because it's me. When you now start to affect other people that I'm in charge with leading and they're holding me to a standard, now the game has changed. And so that's why you can share with someone, there's a standard, there's a margin of error that exists in our friendship that I don't have the flexibility as a leader to offer to you. And so when you're late to work, when you don't get that report in on time, if it was just you and I, friends, I might go, oh, come on, bud, you got to help me out. You got to get on this. However, it doesn't impact anyone else. In this case, this is impacting our whole team. And so I need your help in how I hold you accountable to maintain my leadership. And I hope as a friend, if we're good friends, they're going to help me professionally. So that's I don't want to say it's a come to Jesus talk. I think it's a conversation. It's just with a smile that you say this. Again, it goes back to communication. I'm going to win you over. I'm going to win you over by the end.
So you've touched there on conflict. Obviously, that's one of the things that I know you work with leaders to help them do that better. And one question that sticks out is, how do you diffuse a conflict if it seems to be inevitable? And you talk about it's about preemptive action. What else can you do?
So for anyone who's listening, and if you're taking notes, you're going to pull over and so focus on prevention versus intervention. Intervention, you get to see the results. How many things have I solved, right? Like when we give medication, we can see that we've stopped deaths as of interest. When you look at COVID, as a point of interest. In intervention, we can go, okay, we had some. Prevention, you never know because it never happened, right? So wouldn't it be great if you didn't have conflict? So for anybody who's listening, what are some things that have the potential to be a conflict? Think about that and have these conversations now. And again, they're just conversations. What's your perspective in the event this happens? What are your thoughts on how we should handle this, right? When you get to the point that it's now intervention, you're going to start off. And here's the thinking is you want to gain their perspective. That's the number one thing. So to gain their perspective, you're going to need to ask a question. You say, well, as opposed to what? As opposed to coming in and sharing your perspective, which won't be with the question, it'll be telling. So one is asking versus telling. The second step is getting their perspective first versus yours. So what you will do is that human nature, we want to defend and explain. It's the emotional brain hijacking the rational brain, life or death situation, even though it's not, because you could be talking about them being late, right? It's not a life or death situation. However, the brain treats it that way. Well, for some people, yes. If you call 911, it would be.
Depends how late they are, you know.
Yes, exactly. That's true. Yes, it is.
I'm joking, obviously.
No, but what I love about the joke is the reality is how often do we treat issues as life or death that really aren't. And so contextually, I think if you look at the scenario is, and this is me just, processing as we're talking, is maybe to determine the intensity of the situation, right? And so, if it's a first occurrence versus third occurrence, is it a willingness or an ability issue that's going on might give you context. What's most important is that you don't react, meaning that there's no time lapse and you tell them something, and that you respond, which means that you pause and ask a question. And so say there is a conflict around, they're not getting their reports in on time. So you could start off with, hey, you're not getting your reports in on time and you need to get them in on time. And if this happens again, I'm going to have to write you up. So that would be one way people might approach conflict. And again, this is low-hanging fruit. And I'd love for people to write in, by the way. I do a video, and if you go to the website, you can see them under Q&A of the most common questions. So please feel free to write in, and I respond with that. Is I would ask someone, as it relates to your reports and them being in a timely basis, where do you see yourself as far as your punctuality with on-time reports and our ability as a department to rely on that? Again, I'm asking a question. It's not an accusation. I'm seeking out their perspective. I'm trying to see how self-aware this person is. And this is important in conflict because I need to know where there's the pinch point. If the person goes, nah, I'm late to everything, to be honest with you. I'm late to church. I was late to my wedding. I'm late to funerals. I'm like, okay, so they're self-aware. So we don't need to talk about that. Now, it may be around their self-regulation. So I go, okay, we're on the same page then. I appreciate that. I would ask them, how acceptable do you think it is, this current status we have as far as the team's ability? They go, well, I know it's not right. That's different than, well, I don't think it's a big deal. No one has said anything to me. Do you see how asking questions and gaining their perspective gives you additional data and information to know where to go, right? So if they go and you go, oh, okay, well, maybe I haven't shared with you. What's happening by you being late is I'm now having conversations with the client that's very unpleasant. And I'm trying to cover for you, but I'm just defending and explaining. And they go, oh my God, I had no idea whatsoever. Right? This is how it works to diffuse it. I'm working off of their perspective. I'm asking questions to see what they know and how self-aware and can they self-regulate that. So I hope that answers your question. One is prevention, having the conversations ahead of time potentially could be an issue. And then if you're in it, is to ask a question and to seek their perspective on the entire issue. Now, the other step, and this goes a little bit deeper, is once you get to your perspective, before you share it, I would just ask that person, what do you think my perception of that interaction was with you and I last Friday? Did they find it respectful? Like we talk about respect and they go, No, it was a healthy debate on, right? Because in our family, and there you go, you should hear us yell and scream. I should show you this text we have, and we love each other to death. Yet for me, any elevation of voice, profanity is unacceptable. So you see where there could be a disconnect. So if you're truly looking to diffuse, resolve, and avoid the conflict going forward, this is the methodology that will prevent sustainability and a reoccurrence. By the way, what leads to putting people on the defensive is when you start a question with why. So if you said, why were the reports late? Why didn't you have this information to me? Why were you late? Why can't you do this? Why did that happen? It puts people on the defensive. If you ask a question like, well, what needs to happen next time so that we don't have this conversation? Or how could you do this differently so we could get that desired result? That makes people less defensive. You said it. The question is the answer to me in every approach. It's how you ask the question. Again, it's what you say, how you say it, when you say it. And this is why I go back to everything we're talking about really relies very heavily on your ability to communicate.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick a person who's alive or dead, past or present, real or fictional if you want to, who in your opinion perfectly embodies leadership, who would that be and why?
This is like the Miss America question, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to change the world. Let me answer with the first person who comes to mind. I was going to try and be clever with you, but I'm going to do the first person. And please, for anyone who is listening, me not knowing where you are and how this person impacts you, please just take the overarching theme. It's a political figure, right? When I look at President Zelensky in the Ukraine, I just want to say for anyone who's listening, I do not know the political climate. I do not know all those things. That's not what this is about. This is me as being a student of leadership and watching from a distance. And I'm also at the mercy of everything I read. So please, for anyone who's listening, know that. One of the things I observe from what I see and what I read is this servant type leadership where he believes he is there to serve his people. And he has their needs on the forefront of his mind. And so in the messaging I see, I hear that. I don't see somebody in a suit and tie. I see someone in a sweatshirt and jeans. I don't see someone in an office. I see someone on the battlefield. I see someone getting emotional. And so as a current reference, again, based on what I read and what I see, and I know there's propaganda and I'm at the mercy of those things, from what I see, those takeaways, I think here's a leader that does not have the resources that other great countries have, either financially or militarily. And yet he's been able to engage his people at an emotional level. I mean, that they will give him discretionary performance. You have musicians singing in the streets, right? You have people who are fighting that are leaving their wives and their children, and the wives and children are leaving so that their husbands can protect their country. And you get this discretionary performance because I think the leader has given them this clarity, and here's the why, what we're doing, and the people believe in him. They trust him. They respect him. They like him. So I'll stop there. And again, for anyone who's listening, I only say this, that I only have access to the internet and to TV. And so if there's something that applies to your situation I'm not aware of, I don't want to be insensitive to that. How well did I answer that?
It's a good answer. It's not had that one before either, so it's new as well. So that's
okay.
Good. Yeah.
All right, good. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, with the same caveats and accepting that a lot of what you see on kind of the internet is probably propaganda of someone's. But I think,
Yes.
I agree with you. It's a very good example. I think for me, it's two reasons really. One is, even for that country, for him, it would have been so easy when he heard of the invasion to leave and go and be a government in exile. And as far as I can tell, who knows, maybe it's all happening from a bunker somewhere in who knows where, but he hasn't. He's there, he's on the ground, he's risking himself as much as he's asking others to risk. And I think the second thing that we see over here, being a bit closer geographically, or at least you read stories about it, again, I don't know how true they are, is Ukrainian expats going back to fight. And that, to me, is just such a powerful demonstration of the inspiration that good leadership can offer.
I think it's a great example because just like in this situation, which is the life or death, I'm not equating it to business, but if somebody can't relate to what's going on, leaders need discretionary performance. They need their people to be emotionally committed. And so a lot of times they have their mental, physical, and their financial commitment, and people are showing up to work and they're doing their jobs. And we even have, and I don't know if this is universal, but it's come up in the last month or so, quiet quitters. I don't know if that term, but it's people who've quit and stayed at work, right? And so the companies don't have their emotional commitment, and you don't know if you have it till you need it most. And, I think when you look at that president in that country, he has this emotional commitment. It's not like when things got rough, people left and never went back. And, you think of firemen in our country, and I'm sure it's true there. When there's a fire, everybody's running out, they're running back in. There's some other emotional connection, and great leaders are able to elicit this in people and to build it and to maintain it. And so that would be the example. There's probably some funny things I could tell you about Superman, but I don't want to minimize this example. So out of respect to you and respect to what's going on in the world, I'll just leave it at that.
Fair enough. It is a good one. It is a good one. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's been great. Thank you so much for your time. I know you've got a call to get to.
It's a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for
likewise.
me.
What a great conversation. I think probably persuaded me. I don't know if I'd replace the word leadership with the word communication, but communication is definitely top of the list, I think, now for me on key skills that all leaders need. If you'd like to learn more about what Jay does, get in touch, perhaps a copy of his book. I've put his website address in the episode description, so please do click on that and check it out and reach out to him. If you want to know more about leading with integrity and the leadership mentoring and training services that I offer, then you can sign up to the mailing list or get in touch at the website www.leadernotaboss.co.uk/sign up. And that's it from me. Thanks everyone for listening. Now remember, be a leader, not a boss.